Let's talk about bones. What we have here is actually a humerus, but it would represent a generic long bone in the world of bones. And long bones are bones that are longer than they are any other dimension. So most of your arm and leg bones are actually long bones. And what we find here is we find the shaft or the diaphysis of these bones is hollow inside, and that's where we're going to find bone marrow. And then on each end of that diaphysis we have an epiphysis. So a shaft and then a head and another head on the other end. And the bone marrow in the middle. And what we see here is lots of blood supply throughout that bone. Because bone is a living tissue, it has a good blood supply and it actually is capable of healing itself quite quickly. So a broken bone for the most part usually takes 6 weeks or maybe a little bit less to heal. Now, if it's really shattered and busted into lots of little pieces, it might take a little bit longer, but 6 weeks is what we would expect an average bone repair process to take from start to finish. That bone is actually made of lots and lots of these little osteons. So these little structures here, these little circular structures, an osteon, and you can see that bone really is made up of a bunch of those packed together. And inside each osteon we have little blood vessels, we have nerves, and so there's our blood supply and our nerve supply. So a broken bone actually hurts typically because the nerves in that area of damage are impacted by that. Just a brief little discussion here of the spine. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I will post a couple of videos to go along with this topic on the idea of spinal health. And some people think that spinal health involves going to a chiropractor. And I would propose that biologically there are a number of problems with that. And I won't get into all those here in a long, windy diatribe, but the point is, biologically, medically speaking, many of the procedures used in a chiropractic setting are actually not good for you at all. And they're typically not treating the actual problem, rather they're treating the symptoms. And along the way, it's very common that those treatment of symptoms actually makes the symptoms worse, which probably means it's making the underlying problem worse over time. So chiropractic care typically isn't a solution to a problem. It's more of a treat it and try to kick this can farther down the road, and along the way there's the potential at least of causing additional damage. But what you see here is that you see that the spine, if we're looking at someone's side, we're looking in and we see that up here in the cervical region, that would be the upper shoulders and neck. We'd have a little bit of curvature there. We'd have some curvature in the lower to mid shoulders and upper back here. Then we have another curvature coming down here towards the hips and lower back, and then a last little curvature down here below the hips. So really looking at it from the side, the spine is a gently S-curving shape, and that's normal. But if you get too much curvature up here in the upper shoulders and back region, then that will hunch a person over in a hunchback condition. And that's often caused by poor posture, perhaps maybe exaggerated a little bit by osteoporosis or something like that. If you have abnormal curvature down here in the lower back, that's going to sort of give you what's called sway back sometimes, and that is where you lean backwards, hovering back from the hips. A number of different things can cause any of these curvature abnormalities, and we'll get to those in just a second. If we were to look at the spine directly from behind or directly from in front, we would find that there is no natural left and right curvature of the spine. So there's normal, natural front to back curvature, but there is no normal left and right curvature. So if there is curvature of the spine in the left and right direction, we would call that scoliosis. And that can be all the way from a mild case that you might never notice, but occasionally have more pain than you might expect, all the way up to a person who is literally bent over and twisted in all kinds of contorted directions, can't move without pain, really can't exist without pain. And so those would perhaps be the two extremes of that. But in any regard, those can be caused by things, but typically it's caused by an imbalance issue. Instinctively, your body wants to remain balanced and upright. So a poor posture would allow the hunchback sort of thing to develop because it takes effort to hold the spine upright. And if you relax those muscles and they don't hold the spine upright, then you hunch over. And that's easy because it requires zero energy. So that's why a lot of us do that to some degree. But that will actually become permanent if we don't take care of things. Because these little pads, these little blue structures here in between each vertebrae, those are cartilage pads, and they're there to cushion the vertebrae, hold them apart from each other, and if you have too much abnormal curvature of the spine, that will actually cause compression on those discs, and sometimes you hear them referred to as discs. Remember, they're just really cartilage pads. If you've heard of a slipped disc, a bulged disc, a herniated disc, really those are all the same basic thing, and that is that cartilage isn't exactly centered in place. It's slipped out of place a little bit, it's squeezed out of place a little bit because of excessive pressures and contortions perhaps, and it's then pressing on a nerve. Physiologically, there's nothing wrong with a person with that condition, but it definitely causes pain. So it's simply cartilage out of place. And sometimes you can do some therapy that will help with that, and sometimes there's a surgical approach. But I would say with all back problems, surgical approach should be the last possible, last-ditch effort. Everything else has been tried. Because what you find more often than not is after the back surgery, the person experiences more pain or equivalent amounts of pain than they had before the surgery. So the surgery not only maybe didn't make it better, but often resulted in the pain being worse. So I don't know why it's so hard, but it is hard to get back surgeries to come out well. So I really can't recommend that for your average condition. But back to this balance thing. If you are hunched over, that's a balance issue. A lot of times people that get the sway back, so that abnormal lower curvature in the spine, maybe it's because it's someone who's overweight and has extra weight hanging off the front of the body. Instinctively, you would lean the body back, trying to balance that weight over the hips. So for a male, being pot-bellied would be an example of that. For a female, being just overweight in general perhaps could lead to that. If you have left and right curvature that's not caused by some sort of deformity or abnormal anatomy, then we might be looking at balance issues like one leg is shorter than the other one. And it doesn't have to be much before it can start causing some issues. And I've seen cases where it was up to about a 3-inch adjustment or platform on one shoe to raise that leg up to accommodate, in that case, about a 3-inch to 4-inch discrepancy between length of the legs. Obviously, that's not really common. I would propose that most people have a slight imperfection in leg length compared to the other leg, but most of us don't have anything that causes a problem. Most of the time, these are going to be treatable, we'll say, with a shoe insert or a very slightly thickened sole of one shoe to raise it up just a little. Surgically, there are some things that could be done, but those might be an extreme case that certainly shouldn't be done for the average case of scoliosis. When you're driving down the road, are you sitting perfectly straight in your car? Or are you leaned over against the door or leaned over against the center console? And either way, that's going to introduce at least a temporary form of scoliosis. For males, more so than females, we have wallets. And the traditional place for a male to carry a wallet's in a back pocket. But if you're sitting on that wallet, that's then imbalancing or throwing off your balance at the hips, and then you're instinctively leaning one way or the other trying to balance that out. So most of these spinal curvature things have something to do with balance, and your body wants to be balanced. If it has to contort itself to achieve a balanced condition, that's what it will do. So some of those things were something you could do a little bit about. You could adjust your lifestyle. For me, I keep my wallet in a front pocket, so I'm not sitting on it. It's not uncomfortable to me, and it's also not throwing off my left and right balance either. Joints in your body are basically connections between bones, and at every joint there's typically some option for movement. Some joints offer more movement opportunities than others. You can see this gymnast here is exercising some of those joint flexibilities. And for some of you, this might look a little bit extreme. There's curvature at the neck, the middle to lower. The lower back has an extreme curvature going on here. That's not something the average person is capable of. And then there's some curvature going on at the legs. But the leg curvature, there isn't anything abnormal once you straighten out that back. I'll put some videos up as well to go along with this that look at flexibility, range of motion, that sort of thing at different joints, and what some extreme possibilities are. And most of the videos I'll post aren't what your average person can do, but it's what you can do if you really stretch, if you really practice pulling these joints apart and giving them a greater range of flexibility and range of motion than they would normally have. And it will probably ruin your life, but that's part of my job and I enjoy it. The way bones actually grow is sort of interesting, and the first thing that happens is they start as cartilage, specifically hyaline cartilage. And that cartilage forms some sort of shape, usually somewhat in the direction that you want that eventual bone to end up. So this is going to grow a humerus. So we start with this little mass of cartilage here. And then we have some bone cells, some osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are bone builders, so they make bone. Osteoclasts are bone breakers, so they take apart, they dismantle bone, they remove the cartilage or the calcium from it. And those osteoblasts there start to make bone. And really the first kind of bone that's made we see here is spongy bone. We'll look at some examples of spongy bone in a little bit here, but it literally looks like the inside of a sponge. And so what that does is it gives the bone lots of strength, probably more strength than it would have if it was all compact bone, which is very tightly packed bone with no visible spaces between. So it gives it more strength than we would have with compact bone at a significant weight savings. So the more spongy the bone is, the lighter the bone's total mass is going to be. So we start forming that spongy bone, and that happens first here in the diaphysis. You can see we've got lots of blood vessels growing in here, and we've got some bone cells starting to spread through the cartilage. At some point we get to what we call secondary ossification centers down here in the epiphyses. So down here at the end we'll start forming some bone. Up here at the other end we'll start forming some bone while we're still making more bone in the middle. So what we have is bone growing from the middle out towards the ends. Then we have bone start growing at the ends towards the middle. And obviously at some point they're going to meet. And over here we have the diaphysis is pretty much assembled. The epiphyses are mostly assembled, but we still have a pretty solid layer of cartilage here between each of the epiphyses and the diaphysis in the middle. And that's called an epiphyseal plate, or a growth plate. And if you've heard about bone growth plates, this is what we're talking about here. That joint between bone that is formed and other bone that is formed that hasn't yet fused together in the middle. So this would be a young child's bones here, and what this does is it allows for bone growth. Once those growth plates close, in other words, the diaphysis here actually fuses with the epiphyses, so they join here in the middle, and there'll always be a little sort of a squiggly line looking thing here. That's where they finally fused together. And once that happens, vertical height growth attainment stops. So a person doesn't get any taller once the epiphyseal plates of the leg bones fuse together, becoming relatively solid bone from diaphysis to epiphysis. If we look at that up close here, we have a relatively thick layer of stuff going on here, this cartilage. If we look up close here, here's the cartilage, and we've got bone forming up here, we've got bone forming down here, and growth of cartilage in the middle. So as long as that cartilage keeps growing, we can actually extend the length of the bone. There's also the idea of remodeling. And remodeling basically says stack on more cartilage at the end, replace it with bone, and then reshape that bone you just made into the appropriate shape to keep the right proportions, to keep the right shape and functionality going on. Otherwise, the bones would just become huge blobby things that didn't have any particular shape to them and therefore wouldn't be able to do their job like they should. So the key thing here is cartilage allows for bone growth. When cartilage growth stops, bone growth stops. Once that fusion occurs between the epiphyses and the diaphysis, The bone's not going to get any longer. But bone repair is also going to be very much dependent on cartilage growth as well. So let's take a look at that. Before we get there, though, we need to look at this spongy bone. So on the left, we have normal spongy bone. And it doesn't look very strong, but because it's going back and forth in this sort of webbed approach, it is actually supporting itself, cross-hatching itself, and it's actually quite light and quite strong. So that's normal spongy bone. On the right here, we have osteoporotic bone. And what happens there is the cartilage is removed from the spongy bone and it's not put back in. Now, it's normal for bones to act as a calcium reservoir. If blood calcium levels drop below a certain point, osteoclasts, the bone dismantling cells, will remove calcium from that spongy bone and put it into the bloodstream. That helps to regulate calcium levels in the blood and keep them stable, because muscle contraction is dependent upon calcium. So that helps to regulate and allow for that. But with osteoporosis, what happens is you take out calcium, and that's not at all abnormal. That's a normal everyday thing. But also every day you're supposed to put the calcium back in when you achieved what you needed and you had then more come in from the diet, let's say. With osteoporosis, you take out calcium and you don't put it back in. That's typically something that happens around the age of 50 to 60 when that starts happening. Obviously, it could happen earlier, but typically in that 50 to 60 range is when osteoporosis will start to manifest itself, and that's usually when menopause has occurred. So the primary cause for osteoporosis is actually menopause. And menopause is a major hormone recalibration of the body. For the female, that's going from a reproductive hormone cycles to a non-reproductive hormone cycles. So that means the menstrual cycle is shutting off, ovulation is shutting off, and in that process of recalibrating all those hormones, sometimes the hormones that are regulating bone density and bone growth, calcium levels, that sort of thing, sometimes those levels get off. And if that's the case and it doesn't get corrected, then the bones become imbalanced, taking out more than they're putting in. Really, the treatment for that is prevention. So if you start out as a younger person with large, strong, healthy bones, and the way to get that is have adequate calcium intake and lots of exercise. Lots of physical activity and reasonable calcium intake will build strong bones. So start out with good, strong bones, and if you do develop osteoporosis, it will not be as much of a problem as it would have otherwise been, and who knows, you might just be able to avoid it altogether. The treatment for osteoporosis, once it's diagnosed, they do a bone density test and discover that, as you can see here, the spongy areas are extra spongy. And what they'll perhaps recommend is consume a little bit more calcium, increase your physical activity levels, and they might also give you some medications that are supposed to regrow or stimulate bone growth. Those may or may not work. But the real trick there is the exercise thing, which is something you could be doing your entire life. So build large, strong, healthy bones now. You will be much healthier from a bone perspective later in life, no matter what else happens. So bone repair. Most everyone has broken some sort of bone in their body at some point. Some of us knew for sure it was a broken bone, and others maybe didn't know it was broken. But if you stub your toe really hard on something and you hear a loud popping sound, and for several days your toe is swollen and sore, you probably broke a toe. Or maybe you know and you broke your arm and you can't use or move your arm at that point. Or for me, I broke my skull, and that was a certain period of time in my life I'll never get back. So whatever the case may be, that bone breaks. And we get bleeding. Because there was a blood supply to that tissue, when the tissue is damaged, you get bleeding from that. Now, if you cut your finger and it bleeds, the primary purpose of that is to wash out the injury. But we're going to assume this was a clean break. It was contained in the skin, so that means that you don't need to clean it because it's all still inside you. But bleeding just happens because the blood vessel was compromised. But what that really achieves is it sets the stage for repair. So notice here where this hematoma is, which is basically just a fancy word for a blood clot, a big blood mass. Everywhere that hematoma forms, we have scar tissue. and we have cartilage that fills in and replaces that blood mass with cartilage and with a little bit of scar tissue. That holds things together. But also, remember, bone originated from cartilage, so if we repair with cartilage, what do you think is going to happen next? Perhaps you guessed. Bone cells move into that cartilage and replace all that cartilage with bone. Now, this bone is spongy bone. Now, ultimately, you need to make compact bone, but you don't actually make compact bone. You make smooth bone, and smooth bone, or sorry, not smooth bone, you make spongy bone, and spongy bone is eventually compacted into compact bone. So compact bone is what you see on the outside of the chicken when you're eating the chicken leg. What you see is the smooth bone. But if you were to break that open inside, you'd see the spongy bone. So with bone repair, it bleeds. That blood is replaced by cartilage. The cartilage is replaced by spongy bone. And eventually remodeling occurs. The spongy bone is compacted into compact bone. And that lump there where the hematoma was, which became bone eventually, will probably be shaved down over time. So part of remodeling the bone wasn't just keeping the proper shape as you grow it, but it was also, when you repair it, get it back to its proper shape again. So perhaps 5 to 10 years after breaking your arm, if you were to get an x-ray, it probably won't show any sort of visible remnants of that broken bone if all the healing processes worked like they were supposed to. So in the world of broken bone treatment, there's been a lot of changes. It used to be if you broke your arm, you got this heavy concrete-like cast that you carried around for 6 weeks, and then you went to get it chopped off, and that was probably a very unnerving experience. But now the thought process is on broken bones. If it's not a weight-bearing bone, set it, which means get it straightened back up as best the doctor can, support it, and be gentle for 6 weeks. So supporting typically would involve maybe put a splint on it, maybe wrap it a little bit, and let's say the broken arm, so we wrapped it, maybe a little bit of a splint, put it in a sling, and be careful for 6 weeks. And basically what that does is it allows the bone to realign itself the last little bit. If we casted that arm, we force the bone into a particular position, the concrete holds it in place, doesn't allow it to move and readjust itself, and if the doctor didn't get it lined up just perfectly, then it's forced to grow back together crooked. But if you get it pretty close, support it and be careful with it, and leave it alone, it will wiggle itself probably back into a perfect alignment, and then get a much straighter and better heel from that. If you break a leg, that's not an option because you still have to bear weight on that. So we still cast broken legs. But most other broken bones, if it's not a weight-bearing kind of thing, it's support, gentle cushioning, and be careful. And for the most part, that works. If you break a finger, they were never going to do anything more than put a splint on it anyway. And most of the time when we break a toe, we don't even know for sure it's broken. We just hobble around for a couple of days and eventually it stops hurting. So giving the bone a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of opportunity to straighten itself. If it's off just a little, it'll probably take care of that on its own. So bone's pretty magical, pretty smart tissue in a way. It's not deliberately doing that, but that's just how it happens to work. So our understanding of bone growth and repair processes has improved greatly, and that has changed our treatment of those broken bones. Now that's talking about a simple break. If it's busted into a bunch of different pieces, that's not going to do the trick. They'll have to do a lot more work to put that back together. But a clean, simple break on a non-weight-bearing bone, set it, wrap it, support it, be careful for 6 weeks, and most likely you're good to go. Hopefully this all made sense and you learned a lot. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.